Around 30 years ago, a young Australian woman called Margaret was traveling around India on the hippie trail. She was seeking, as she put it, spiritual enlightenment and the two other things that generally go along with rock and roll. And one day, when she was in Calcutta, she was walking through a little dark alley a long way off the main thoroughfare when she came across a small boy who looked about 5 years old and apparently had been beaten and left to die in the gutter. His little body was covered with bruises, bites, cuts, sores, and all kinds of injuries. But he was still alive, and she didn't know what to do, but she had to do something. She just couldn't bear to leave him there. So she did the only thing she could think of. She brought him to Mother Teresa's hospice in Calcutta, and she asked if she could bring the child into the house, and that was fine. So she carried him in and laid him down on one of the beds. And then she went back to her hotel. But she didn't sleep well that night. She needed to know if he was going to be all right. So the next morning, she went back to see him. He was very ill, and it just didn't feel right to leave him there and go away. So she asked if she could stay for a day or two and help to look after him. And so she did. She nursed the child devotedly day and night. And after about a week, as the child started to improve, she began to help with the nursing of the other sick people in the hospice. Days became weeks. After about 3 months, Mother Teresa herself came to her while she was working, and without any unnecessary preliminaries, simply asked her whether she had ever considered entering into religious life. Margaret was very taken aback, but also moved and flattered by the offer, because she knew that it was very unusual for Mother Teresa to ask people directly to join her congregation. But she said, "Well, you see, I'm not actually at all religious. Both my parents are atheists. I've never been to church in my life. I've never been baptized. I'm not sure that I'm really the sort of person that becomes a nun." "Oh," said Mother Teresa, "don't worry about that. When the actions of the heart are right, the words of the mind will follow." And that, I think, is what both Paul and Jesus are telling us today. Paul had great affection for the community in Philippi. Philippi was an important Roman colony, and its inhabitants enjoyed favor under Roman law. Military veterans settled there. Caesar Augustus exempted the city from many taxes. Paul had had a vision that summoned him to preach in Philippi, and it was the very first European city evangelized by Paul and his companions, Silas and Timothy. The Christian community in Philippi had supported Paul, and he had warm relations with them, as we can see in the letter to the Philippians. And when Paul wrote to the Philippians, he was in prison at that stage, probably in Ephesus. And during his arduous travels, it must have given Paul encouragement and good feelings whenever he thought of the Philippians and their high esteem for him. And those memories and feelings would have been a consolation to Paul in his imprisonment. Still, Paul is not shy about encouraging the Philippians to be Christians, not just in good feelings or lofty words, but he wanted them to put their words into action. They were not to act selfishly or seek praise for their good works. And with the Philippians, we are also challenged by Paul to act in daily life in ways that match our words and our ideals. Paul quotes a very powerful hymn which emphasizes the selflessness and the humility of Jesus. And we think of Jesus who humbled himself, becoming obedient to the point of death, even death on a cross. So Paul is reminding us that Jesus says yes to God, and that yes to God reflects the parable of the two sons. Now, there's a lot of tension behind Jesus telling this parable. Jesus had arrived in Jerusalem, and today's story takes place just after he had driven out the buyers and the sellers from the temple precincts. And when he did that, he really infuriated the religious leaders. And the leaders should have recognized this prophetic action and seen the hand of God working through the words and works of Jesus. But opposition to Jesus was getting pretty intense at that stage, and soon these religious leaders would agitate for his death. And so Jesus directs this parable to the chief priests and the elders. First of all, God is the father of the two sons as we reflect on this parable. And the first son says to his father, "No ways, Dad. I'm not going to go out in the hot sun and work with the vines, breaking my back, pulling weeds, trimming vines, heaping manure around the stalks. It's not for me. I'm your son. I don't need to stoop to do the work of slaves." That's the attitude of the first son. And this is the attitude of those who have heard God's call for working in his kingdom and are just too busy or maybe too shy or too self-centered to spend time and energy being compassionate to the people we encounter, or the family into which we are born, or the enemies who compete with us for wealth and power and fame. It's the attitude saying, "No, I've got no time to care about others. I've not got energy enough to accumulate, acquire, and build my reputation and do other stuff. There's only just so much time in my days. I need every single minute for me, myself." So we'll note that this son goes along with this attitude for a little while. Then something happens that changes his mindset. Many spiritual writers will say that this first son came into some suffering which opened his eyes and thus opened his heart. There is repentance, so there's a change in attitude towards others and towards what is of lasting value in his life. And so, the first son, without any fanfare, without shouting, "Hey, Dad, I've changed my mind," or anything like that, he goes to work in the vineyard to do to build the kingdom. That's the first son. Then there's the other son who quickly responds to the father's request. His attitude is, he says, "Certainly, Father, I'd get right to it, and I'll make the vineyard the envy of all." But what does he do? He just goes his own way, seeking out whatever pleases him or gains for himself things, control over others, the bowing and the scraping that make others one's servants. So the parable is a reminder that despite our past and our present misdeeds and our stubbornness, we are again offered a chance to change, to find welcome in the kingdom of heaven. And this is good news for anyone who has chosen a path away from God and from God's ways. So this parable is a challenge. It's also an invitation to change. It's not enough to say, "I'm a Catholic," unless our lives reflect the identity that we claim. Our initial yes to serving God has to be backed by action. And this is an even greater challenge now as we live in the midst of the coronavirus pandemic. For 6 months we've been in lockdown, with our lives turned upside down. We've been unable to attend Mass. But now things are easing up. It's level 1 and things are getting better. And on Monday in our parish, we begin public Masses again. I'm so excited that we can celebrate with the people again. And so we need to ask for ourselves today, what follows? What's the vineyard to which we are being sent to labor for God these days? How can we be doers of the word? So we really, at this moment, need to take notice of the good work that so many are doing. There are inspiring stories of people feeding the hungry, housing the homeless, risking their lives serving in medical centers and emergency wards, etc. Some may be Christian, others are not. But in their yes to serve others, we recognize the Spirit of Jesus present and inspiring them. And we recognize the work of our bountiful and gracious God. And we give praise in the words of Paul's closing words. And he said, "And every tongue confess that Jesus Christ is Lord, to the glory of God the Father." So, in saying all of this, I like to think that Paul sees Jesus as the third son in the parable, not mentioned, the third son who willingly and quickly and totally says yes to God, goes and does the work that he has been assigned to do. And as we continue to think of this parable, what's interesting as well is the fact that there's no mention of how things turned out. How hard of a worker was the first son? Did he meet the quotas? Did he do what was necessary? There are no measurements in the story, just someone who changes his mind and his heart. He was able to respond, after a little while, to an invitation. And maybe that is what is pleasing to God. Our desire and efforts to do what God wishes, and at the same time leaving plenty of room for God to step in and fill in the gaps, the big ones, the small ones, to be with us. When we think of the change of heart of this first son, we can ask ourselves, where and how must my heart change? Towards whom must my heart soften and forgive? It is the middle of the pandemic, and we're limited. Sometimes many of us are limited to, confined to home and to work. But even there, we can do some important work. We can pray for a renewed heart and the desire to act on it. We don't want to right now make a list and then present it to God showing our past performances. We may have not much that to show God, or we might have done things that we don't want God to see. But through this parable of the second chance, grace is given to enable us today to change our minds, to start anew. And this parable is good news for those who think it's too late to change or struggling to change. And Jesus reassures us today that we can have his help to redirect our lives, to say yes to the God who calls us and who enables us to change.